Let's get started. So we have a pretty mixed audience today, ranging from folks who are, you know, uh, deep into the IAM space and others who are relatively new to it. So to make it comfortable for everybody, we're going to start from like the very basics. Um, and so this is the first part of a series that we're going to do. It's about 10 sessions altogether. So our focus today is going to be more about defining what IAM is, and then focusing on how we can install OpenIAM in a Docker environment. Right. Future sessions that we'll do will focus on the normal use cases, the onboarding of users, connecting to Active Directory, then the workflows, reconciliation. The goal is that by the end of this, we should be able to do at least a fairly comprehensive POC of sorts or a prototype to deploy OpenIAM in a workforce identity type of environment, right? We'll be doing a follow-up session after this where we kind of focus on a customer IAM use case and another one which is more developer oriented, right? But the idea is to kind of do this, and we'll be doing these on a regular basis as the product evolves to be able to kind of do that. Right? So let's start with, in terms of the focus, we're going to talk about what IAM is. We'll then talk a little bit about the deployment options within OpenIAM, and then we'll, work on an actual deployment. Okay. So let's, take a look at the need for IAM. So we have, we can use Gartner's definition for this. So basically Gartner says that IAM is the need to be able to grant the right level of access at the right time for the right reasons, right? Meaning that access should not be granted before it's needed. It should not linger longer than it's needed. We should be able to give it for the right reasons, meaning that somebody asked for it. It's their job requires it, as in birthright access. Those would be, what we would consider as the right reasons and right time, right? IAM is also kind of interesting space because it's a blend of both business skills and technical skills. So it requires, an understanding of the business in terms of, and each business is unique. Today, we have quite a few customers in various parts of the world and in various industries. And as much as there's a common need, there's also nuances which are different, which make this an interesting, problem. So you need a blend of business skills and technical skills to be able to, to successfully implement OpenIAM or really any IAM kind of product, right? When at the end of it, the outcome, when you're able to do this successfully, one of the benefits is that companies should be able to save costs. You should become significantly more efficient in terms of being able to automate certain processes, in terms of provisioning and deprovisioning. Our costs of audit should be going down. We have customers where they tell us that they used to spend like 2-3 months on access certifications, and now they're doing it in a week, right? So there should be a significant savings in terms of time and money in that respect. And also in the respect of that, we should also become a lot more agile in terms of being able to respond to business needs, right? So let's say there's a reorg or people are moving around, to be able to handle those kind of adjustments in an efficient way. Okay, so when we look at the current landscape, it's much more complex than it's ever been. So today we have applications which are on premise, your traditional data center. We have our databases, our Active Directories, various applications just running in an on-premise data center. Then we have, our cloud platforms, right? Your AWSs, your Azures, and we have identity that's there as well. And then we have our SaaS applications, right? Your Workday, Salesforce, Office 365s, which so many companies are using. And the challenge is that identity information is now in all of these places. And for the information security group, this is now a bigger challenge than it ever was, that we have to manage this diverse landscape with companies which are geographically distributed and identities which are well beyond the corporate firewall, right? So it definitely poses a significant effort in terms of reining all of this in. So if we look at, kind of step back and look at this landscape, and we really see a few different drivers, right? So if you're looking at the workforce identity space, like we are today, then the drivers are often really focused on the regulatory mandates, right? You're achieving your SOC 2 compliance, your GDPR requirements. It's about making end users' life a little bit easier, making the InfoSec people's lives a little bit easier, to not have to do the complicated spreadsheets every quarter to do their access certifications. So it's compliance and cost and security that's kind of driving this. If we look at customer IAM, it's a little bit different. Security is certainly a big important, but so is the end user experience, right? We want to make things easier, more efficient for them. We also want to reduce the help desk costs. And also the information that we capture here, we can potentially use it to improve the business relationship with the end customer. And that could be either a B2C or a B2B type of relationship, right? There's a third case that we're seeing more and more, which is where we want to be able to embed identity. We see more and more customers building applications or services where they want to embed an identity solution as part of that platform, and they don't want to, recreate their own IAM solution, right? So these various drivers. Our focus really is going to be the enterprise, the workforce IAM case today. Okay. Now, if we look at OpenIAM in terms of this context, and have to describe what OpenIAM is, then the simplest way that I can say it, it's an OpenIAM an identity access management platform that's based on a converged architecture. Converged architecture is the term that Gartner is using now to define products which have a unified platform, which have identity access, and in some cases, some pieces of privileged identity as well. OpenIAM has all of these pieces in it, and some which go a little bit beyond that. And while the term converged architecture is relatively new in the last year or so, OpenIAM was the first company to the market with that by about 12 years. So in maybe a little more than 12 years. In 2008, when we started out with a converged platform, right? So that being said, if you look at the capabilities, identity governance, we have the usual lifecycle management capabilities, also the ability to do request approvals and the workflows and the access certifications. And those are all things that we will look at as we go through this. On the web access management side, this is where we have our single sign-on capability, the ability to SSO into using SAML or OAuth or OpenID Connect. And there's also beyond that, there's a reverse proxy which can also do SSO to legacy applications. We also recently integrated a RPA framework into this mix, right? So with the RPA framework, we can, integrate really legacy applications which don't have any kind of API or don't support any kind of SAML or OAuth or OpenID type of components, right? And then, and one of the things I forgot to say was I prefer to keep these sessions interactive. So as you have questions by going through it, feel free to post your questions. I'll answer them as best as I can. We will also in the next day or two try to publish a formal response to any questions that we see here, so that people have this for future reference. So the first question is, will we get any practice environment or study material out of this? So we will be doing a live demo to kind of do the installation, but there's no lab per se. So you can download OpenIAM and you can install it and do the trials as we're going through them here as well. Okay, so transitioning a little bit more to our deployment and setting a little background. So there's multiple ways that we can deploy OpenIAM, and so first of all, you can choose between doing an on-premise deployment, or you can do a cloud deployment, right? So on-premise for us really means your data center of choice, whether it's in your corporate data center or using one of these cloud platforms. And the reason we draw a distinction between in calling it a cloud native platform is that we do have the ability to, when we're deploying on AWS, Azure, and Google, to leverage the services which they have, right? So as you'll see in our stack, there are quite a few components there, and we're able to run in a native environment on those platforms. Okay. The other part is that that we can also, you can choose between deploying in in an RPM or in a Kubernetes type of environment, you can pick and choose. Or you can also use OpenShift, which is more of a layer onto a Kubernetes type of platform. Right? Okay, so looking a little bit at containers, which is really our focus today. And so we made a move to a containerization, right? Containerized platform pretty early on. So in about 2016, we went through a re-architecture, and we're always going through incremental upgrades. So as part of that, so I think in 2017 is when we delivered a full stack. So that we moved the whole platform, which was there prior to that, which was like kind of J2E type of platform where it was running on JBoss and using the infrastructure that came with it, to a much lighter weight containerized model and more of a microservices approach. And the reason being is we wanted to make it easier to deploy, wanted to be able to make it easier to scale. And there are quite a few benefits that containerization provides us. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail, as we start to go through this. So our deployment today is going to be using Docker Swarm. And so there are really two types of orchestration technologies, right? So there's Docker Swarm, and which is which is provided by Docker, the company that makes the Docker engine. And then there's the Kubernetes environment, and they're both have their pluses and minuses. So with Docker Swarm, it's really incredibly easy to get started, and you'll see that today. And sometimes I talk to people and they say, well, we don't know how to use Docker. And it's shockingly simple how easy it is to get started with it, especially if you're deploying somebody else's prepackaged containers. If you look at Kubernetes, on the other hand, it's an entirely separate story. It's extremely powerful, but it's also extremely complex, and there's a steep learning curve that goes with it. So normally what I tell people is that you should pick the one that fits your needs best. So if you're doing a small deployment or you have a small environment, you don't need significant high availability or scalability requirements, then Docker Swarm is a great way to get started, especially like if you're looking at a POC. If you have a large user base, you have complexities, you need high availability, you need to have complex needs, then you should definitely not be using Kubernetes, especially, you should be using Kubernetes and not be using Docker Swarm. And part of that is also that some of the components that we use, for example, like the Vault, don't really cluster well in a Docker Swarm environment, right? Whereas in a Kubernetes environment, we have all of that working extremely well. Yeah. So, and to give you a little bit of an idea, this is what the internal stack of OpenIAM looks like. So there's all these boxes are really containers which are inside OpenIAM. So the things which are in blue are really their product capabilities, right? There are services which we have developed. The things which are in gray, things like Redis and Elasticsearch, those are infrastructure components that the stack is using. So, for example, like Redis is a distributed cache, whereas Elasticsearch is an internal search engine that we use to, and these were created or introduced to help speed up how we work. Right? With that said, let's jump over to the installation of this. Okay, so I've already SSH'd into a terminal window. So I've created a Ubuntu VM, and we're going to go through and install the OpenIAM, right? And so I think there's a question here: what are the criteria for a small environment? So I think that if we look at a small environment, I think that it's really a number of users that we want to integrate together. The number of apps, it doesn't really place a lot of load on that side, and the way that we deploy that can vary. So I would really look at it as a number of users. Then there's another question which is a little bit non-technical. Says, are there any federal government implementations of OpenIAM Yes, there are two federal government deployments of OpenIAM that have been going on for at least 2 years. And if you have any questions, just drop me a note. I can't really discuss customer names on a general webinar. Okay. So let's get on. Let's move forward with it. So the first thing is we want to install, make sure some basic tools that we want are already on here. So for example, we want to make sure that we can, we have Nano as our editor. You can use any editor that you want to. Nano is what I'm comfortable with. We want to make sure we have Git, and we also want to have wget installed, right? The next thing is we need to make some environment changes. So Elasticsearch requires certain Nmap values, and the default Linux values don't really work too well for that. So let's edit the sysctl conf file, and we can just do, right? And we can just scroll down to the bottom of the screen, and so the question is, what's the environment configuration that I'm using here? So that's a really good question. So I've got a VM which has got about 32 gigs of RAM and 8 vCPUs. You can probably get away with 24 and 6, but that's really kind of pushing it. And this is really important. In our documentation, we have kind of spelled out that what the minimum requirements are. And it's shocking how many times you'll see people trying to deploy on a VM with like 1 gig of RAM and 1 CPU. And then they'll open up a support ticket that it doesn't work. And quite honestly, it wasn't meant to work that way, right? The containers themselves have certain, memory requirements. No, 8 gigabytes will absolutely not work. You will need at least 24, and I strongly recommend 32. Yeah. So the minimums are the minimums, really. So they're not really that optional. Okay. So we've made the changes to the sysctl file. So we want to load them, and we can validate them. So we can run the sysctl-p command, and we'll see these changes which have been echoed. Okay. And at this point, let's go ahead and install the Docker engine. So there's a question here about, will I explain the difference between OpenIAM and some of the other products out there? It's not something which I had planned, but we can certainly work that into one of our sessions if that's important. Okay, so happy to do that. But keep in mind that when I'm commenting on another vendor, you should take it with a grain of salt, that I'm not an expert on those products, and it's a best case comment, and you shouldn't take it as the word of God, right? So so here, so we're again going back to this. So we're basically installing a few basic things on here, and the next thing is, depending on your Ubuntu distribution, you may need to set the Docker repository, right? So in this case, in our distribution, we need to. So there's a question here: is if I deploy in Docker Swarm, can I split each container on different nodes? Yes, you can. You certainly can. And in fact, that's a common way that we can do things, where we can separate out we can separate out the UI layer from the service layer. We can separate out the database layer from this, right? There's another question here about ForgeRock's OpenIAM, OpenIDM, and OpenIAM. There's a long history there. We can discuss that as we get to the end of this, if we have some time. Just for your information, OpenIAM was started about 2 years before ForgeRock was started, and OpenIAM was built with its own code base. Whereas ForgeRock leveraged the OpenSSO and OpenIDM source code from Sun Microsystems way back when. And yes, these are both separate companies, and they've always been separate companies. And that's, I think the history beyond that, I can happily get onto in a separate conversation. Okay, so here we've set up our repository, and you'll see that there's a small problem here. Down here, there's an error that says that it doesn't like the repository that's not signed. Okay, and this won't show up everywhere, but it will show up in some cases. And the way to deal with this is, if you see this in your Ubuntu distribution, is to basically edit the sources.list file, right? And way at the bottom, you'll see an entry here. So this entry here, we can clone this, copy this command. Comment out the first one, and then we can change this focal to that. Okay, and see if I did that correctly. And at this point, we can save that, and then we can run this curl command here that will fix the signing problem. Okay, so we're good there. Now let's go ahead and install the Docker engine. We should be good to go. Okay, yep, so I want to install this. We'll continue. The next thing is we want to be able to turn on once this is done. So the question is OpenIAM only Linux-based? So the core part of OpenIAM is Linux-based. We don't support Windows-based deployment in the core. The connectors, though, we have a pretty good collection of connectors for AD and Azure and all the things that Microsoft makes, which are all Windows-based because they're all .NET and PowerShell. So that part of OpenIAM is definitely native to Windows, but the core definitely requires a Linux environment. Okay. So let's start the Docker services, and container D is next. And so once this is done, then let's do, a Docker run the world. And if this is okay, it says hello from Docker, we're good to go. So that means our Docker engine is up and running, right? So at this point, since we're using the enterprise version of OpenIAM, we need to lock into Docker Hub. So Docker Hub is our Docker registry. It's the default registry. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but a Docker registry is used to basically as a way to kind of, for us to distribute the Docker containers, right? And so the question was, while I'm doing this, okay, sorry about that. So the question was, the steps that I'm following, they're from the official manual. And yes, they are. I'm actually just cutting and pasting instructions from the documentation to make sure it is there. So the other question was, do I have MFA enabled? And in this case, I don't. It was just me looking at the wrong password, which I was cutting and pasting. So it was my bad, not anything technical. But thank you for the question and the comment. So we're connected to Docker Hub. And so at this point, we need to install Docker Compose. So, and we'll explain this in a little bit more detail, but so whereas Docker, the Docker engine is used to run a container, that Docker Compose is more of it's a way to define how multiple containers can work as one application, how we can kind of configure them and define them together, right? So here we're basically installing the Docker Compose, requirements that we need, changing some permissions, and then now we're actually going to focus a little bit more on the OpenIAM part, right? So at this point, let's we're gonna basically we're gonna copy down the OpenIAM Docker Compose project. And so basically this project has in it a whole bunch of Docker Compose files. It has some scripts which help control how we're going to start up and shut down. And we'll talk about that in a second as well. Right. And right. So here, since we have different versions, Okay, so we're going to use release 4212. And at this point, let's take a look at what. So you see here, there's our environment scripts as a startup and shutdown, and then this package here, or just a folder here of 3.2, which is really where a lot of the Docker Compose files are being kept. Right? So one of the things that we need to do is in the architecture, there's a vault. The vault is where we're keeping our secrets. So we need to initialize that vault. And the way to do that is we need to basically edit this environment .sh file. And when you open it up, you'll see that there's a number of things in here that range from the version of OpenIAM that we're pointing to some of the passwords that we have. But it also has things like, which database type are we using? So in this case, we're going to use MariaDB. But if you were going to be using Postgres or Oracle or SQL Server, you would just change the database type, right? And so there's two steps here from the documentation that we're going to combine at one step. So one is we're going to take care of setting up that password for the vault to initiate that certificate. And then we're also going to do a little bit of the database parameters. We're going to do them at the same time too, right? So here we're just going to give it a nonsensical password like, right? And then up here, we're going to go and make a few changes here. So OpenIAM uses a tool called Flyway. Flyway is a database schema versioning tool, and it's used for really two reasons. One is to be able to create the initial installation of OpenIAM to basically apply all the scripts in the database that it needs to. And when you're doing upgrades, it's to be able to take a point in time and to be able to upgrade you towards that point in time. So in this case, so let's just define the port, and we're going to be using MariaDB, and that's going to be 3306 that it's going to be running on. Sorry, and there are two schemas within here. So there's a OpenIAM schema, which is where the core part of OpenIAM runs, and then there's activity, and that's where all of our workflows information is being kept. Right, so for the host, since this is going to be running the default container, we can put in database here, right? Which internally means that it's pointing to the local Dockerized instance. If you were running on a remote database, if you had your own separate database server, which a lot of our customers do, then you can be putting in the host name here to point to it. Okay. So let's save this here at this point, and now let's generate our certificate. Right. It's going to say, yep, did I set that password? Yes, I did. The certificate has been created, and I can see that the files are already in place. And at this point, we want to start to download the containers. Sorry, actually, before we do that, let's initialize Docker Swarm. So now Swarm has been initialized, and at this point, we can run the setup script. So this is just going to basically pull down all of all the containers from Docker. This is going to go on for a couple of minutes. Okay. So while this is going on, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have, or we can continue with other things. So a couple of things that while we're looking at this, so forget. So there's a question about some of the connectors which are available. So by default, when you install Docker, you'll see a connector which is for Docker, which for LDAP. You'll see that as being one of the you'll see these various containers being pulled through. In the setup.sh file, there are lines which are commented out. Yeah, so we can share the PowerPoint if you'd like. And in fact, later on today, we'll publish the recording of this, and we will share the PowerPoint along with this as well. So in the setup.sh file, there's a number of containers for connectors which are commented out. So if you want to turn on one of those connectors, you just need to uncomment that file, that line, and rerun the setup.sh file. It will download that container. As we add new connectors, it will basically, you'll be able to pull them down from Docker Hub and expand in that way. Okay. And there's a variety of connectors. I mean, they range from, support for Oracle EBS, for SAP, for G Suite, for Linux. There's about 40 to 45 connectors which are there out of the box, which you can use. Right? There's another question here about the databases that we support. So today we support MariaDB or MySQL. We support Postgres, Oracle, and SQL Server, Microsoft SQL Server. So you can pick really from any one of those four. Right? Okay, so we've downloaded our containers. So we are now ready for the next step, which is to start them up. And it's really that's all we need to do. So at this point, the startup script's going to run, and it's going to start initializing a bunch of variables. So in Docker, and this is probably a good point to kind of go into that a little bit. Some of the concepts around Docker. So, and these are terms that you will kind of get used to. So, if you hear the word images, so it basically refers to the actual file or that contains all the source code, the binaries, the dependencies, which are needed to kind of run an application. So Docker images are they're just like, it's like a template. You can't, they're not something which you execute. They're not really executables, right? The containers are actually basically, they represent a runtime image, which you have there, and these containers, you can compare them to a VM, but they're a little bit different in the sense that a VM is basically, it's a self-contained virtual machine, right? It's got your OS and everything else that you need to be able to run. So the Docker containers have all the things that you need to run a container except for that host OS. So they're going to be running on the OS that so in that respect, it's significantly lighter than a VM because it doesn't have all that operating system overhead it's kind of bringing with it. You'll also hear the word registry, and so like I said before, a registry is where all your Docker images are stored and how we can distribute them. So that a default registry is Docker Hub, and that's where OpenIAM kind of distributes its containers from. It's a safe repository to use. There's some of our customers, especially there was a question about the federal government where they have deeper security requirements, and even some of our larger enterprise customers, they have their own ways of doing this. So what they do is they have a process which will bring down our containers from Docker Hub, and they will install it in their own local registry, and then they will build the DevOps mechanism using something like Chef or an Ansible, and they will take those tools and they will deploy from their local repository, right? So this way, any deployments that they do in their environment are always coming from a source which they control, right? So Docker Hub is not the only registry that's out there. Okay. Docker volumes are another word that you will hear. So Docker containers by themselves are stateless. So imagine that if I have my MariaDB running in a container, I do a whole bunch of work and then I shut it down. That means all my changes are gone, right? So there's no state to it, right? So whenever you restart it, it's going to be fresh again, and pretty much it's useless to us from from a database perspective, right? So Docker volumes are what allow us to kind of have a storage mechanism for these containers so we can persist data. And so you'll see, like in our startup script, that it's actually going to be creating a number of volumes to kind of get off the ground, right? And those volumes can be both local or they can be remote. So It can also be used to kind of share information between containers. So it's a critical part of the Docker architecture. And Docker Compose, as I said, it's a way to define how containers interact with each other, right? So, how much memory will one container have when, does it start up, what the dependencies it may have. So those are all, and they're defined in YAML files. And YAML files, it stands for yet another markup language. The syntax is not terribly hard to use, but it is one more thing to learn and be aware of. But if you're using OpenIAM and you're using this as defaults, there's nothing really to change in those files to be able to get started, right? So there are also some commands. Let's just see where we are in this. Okay, so this process is on its way. Let's use our first command here to watch these containers start up. Okay, and you can see that they're already running. And there's one more which is starting. And so once this is up and these others are up, we'll be ready. So you'll see that by using the Docker, PS Hub, you can watch the containers start up. You can see that they're healthy. And once they're healthy, we are able to, to connect and log into them, right? So a couple other commands that will come in handy for you are being able to use Docker logs. And you'll see that there's a container ID here. And the container ID, you can really just pick it up from here. So this first column under Docker PS is showing us the container ID. So if we take that container ID, we can go get the logs of what's going on with that container. And this is extremely helpful when we're trying to basically troubleshoot. Okay. Sometimes we need to connect to the container. So remember, it's its own little box, right? You can connect to it and you can look at the logs and you can run commands. So for example, we can connect to the MySQL or the MariaDB container, and we can, run, the MySQL command line from there and do all the things that we normally do. So it is, as much as things are different, they're still pretty similar, right? And then the last one is a restart command. So if we want to restart a particular container and not restart the whole stack, then that's another way of kind of going about this, right? So I think we should be close to having our system start up. Okay, it looks like it's the UI container. The UI container is always the last one to come up. So we'll give it a couple more minutes. So while that's going on, let's go back and talk a little bit more about the configuration options, right? So we ran the setup command, right? And we ran the setup script, and this kind of pulled down all the OpenIAM containers that you needed and all the other dependencies that were needed to do that. The environment.sh file, which we kind of updated a little bit when we did the certificate and the database. So there's a lot more that you can do there. So some of the other things you can do is you can set the log levels there for like the logging that we're going to do. You can define your database drivers, the ports we're going to be using, the passwords for the key components. So those are all defined in the environment.sh file. And if you change them, you can just rerun that script, and right now it's set up and start up, but you're actually, I think, invoking the script along the way. And the startup process is really just that. It's going to do, it's going to create the volumes. It's going to create everything that's needed to be able to start OpenIAM. If you need to stop them, you can use like the shutdown.sh command, and that will stop, all of your containers, right? And sometimes, sorry, you need to do a cleanup, right? For whatever reason, maybe you made a mistake during installation, you're new to it. You can use a teardown. A teardown will basically blow away the volumes, right? So the place where you're storing all your data. And then when you do a startup again, it will rebuild them, right? But if you have anything sensitive in them, don't do a teardown. You will lose everything. So just be careful about running that command. It can be extremely helpful or it can be extremely destructive, depending on, when you're running it. Okay, this is almost ready. Okay. Okay, any other questions that are out there which we can help with in the meantime? So the questions about the regulatory compliance and the standards in OpenIAM. So in so when we look at when we look at like the regulatory compliance, right? The one that comes up probably the most is probably like, helping support SOC 2 compliance, right? There's also need to support GDPR and PCI compliance. So when it comes to doing the SOC compliance, the sorry, the focus is really to kind of support those activities, right? To be able to give the audit information which is needed there. So in this case, we're really basically just providing the tools that you need to be able to perform those activities and also generate the reports that you need for them, right? So here, our containers have started. All of them are healthy. So at this point, let's do a smoke test, right? And the smoke test is going to be to run a curl command that's going to hit the login URL. Okay. And this says everything is good. We're ready to give it a try. So let's open up a browser window. And since this box doesn't have a DNS name, I'm going to and there are two URL endpoints. There's web console, and then there's self-service. So in this case, both of them are going to go to the same place. So this question is, what if some of my containers are stuck and restarting and they keep rebooting? So the first thing that I would check is if that is happening, is if the VM has the minimum the minimum system requirements. If we have those, then also check to see if the other dependencies are up. So the UI is dependent on everything. So if for example, Elasticsearch is down or RabbitMQ is down, which is the message bus, or the Vault is down, the UI will not start. So it will keep looping until it comes back up. If all of those things seem fine, what I would do is I would use the Docker logs command and take a look to see what the logs are telling us. If it's something that seems obvious to you, then great. If it's not obvious to you, then drop us a note, and we will be happy to help you, work through it. Okay. There's a question about the difference between, CE and EE. That's on our website, but we can also share that. And there's another question that do you have to use Docker? Well, if you want to use you can use an RPM deployment if you want to, in which case you don't have to use Docker. If you're going to use Swarm or you're going to use Kubernetes or OpenShift, then by default you have to use a containerized model, right? And then the next question is, are OpenIAM licenses for registered users only, or depending on the module and on the license type? So there's a community version which you can use, and there's documentation that's out there which you can use for it. Outside of that, the enterprise version is a subscription-based model that's based on the number of users. Okay. So let me just log in here, and so sysadmin is the default ID. The default password is PASSW00, and it will ask you to change that next. So here it's going to show me the default password policy. And the policy is something that you should change as part of your deployment process. This is just a default to kind of get started with, right? So our password is changed, and we're now going to go to the next step, which is to define a content provider. And most people ask me, what is a content provider? Well, a content provider is, in the context of OpenIAM, and maybe if we compare it with other products, it's just basically it's like an alias to a domain. So we're basically creating a name to map to, and so it's a strange terminology, but that's kind of what it's really referring to. And we can have more than one content provider in the system. So, and we'll look at that as we go through our deployment process, right? So in this case, I have not, and it's going to pick up the host machine on its own. If it's not, right there is a sign that there's a problem, okay? And let's just say we're only supporting HTTP because we haven't set up our certificate yet. And the application server, this is where the service layer is residing. It's also picking that up on its own. And so we say okay here. And once this is saved, there's an internal cache. Sometimes the cache can take a couple of minutes for it to refresh. But so in this case, we are going to have challenge questions. Now, a lot of people don't use challenge questions anymore, and you can turn this off as you're configuring your policy, right? And personally, I can never remember my answers to any of these questions anyway, so it's okay. We're in, installation's up, we're done, and we're basically ready for the next step, which will be in our next session. You know, if there are any more questions, I'm happy to answer them. You know, otherwise, I want to thank everybody for making the time and joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week.